Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching the autumn leaves drift across the modest front yard of the house that had sheltered 3 generations of her family. The morning light cast long shadows through the oak trees her grandmother had planted 40 years ago, the same trees that would soon witness a battle neither the elderly woman nor young Sarah could have imagined when she was a child playing beneath their branches. The certified letter had arrived 3 days ago, its legal seal as cold and impersonal as winter frost. Sarah set her coffee cup down with hands that trembled only slightly, the ceramic making a soft clink against the wooden table her grandfather had built. She had read the documents so many times that the threatening language had burned itself into her memory. Fraudulent documentation, improper transfer of title, demand for immediate vacation of premises. The words swirled together like a legal tornado designed to uproot everything she held dear. Marcus Webb had never set foot on this property, had never breathed the sweet scent of her grandmother's roses, or felt the smooth bark of trees that remembered when this land was nothing but rolling hills and wild grass. Yet somehow, this stranger believed he owned what her family had cultivated for decades. The audacity was breathtaking, but Sarah had learned that wealth could purchase not just luxury, but the illusion of righteousness. Webb's reputation preceded him like the shadow of a storm cloud. He was the kind of man who wore $1,000 suits to breakfast meetings and spoke of human lives as if they were chess pieces to be moved across his personal board. His business empire had grown through a combination of shrewd investments and strategic cruelty, purchasing distressed properties and displacing families with the efficiency of a natural disaster. Local newspapers had covered his previous ventures with a mixture of admiration for his success and unease about his methods. The law firm of Richardson, Hayes & Associates occupied 3 floors of the most expensive building in the state capitol, their letterhead embossed with gold that caught light like tiny suns. Sarah had counted the names at the bottom of the legal correspondence. 10 lawyers, 10 highly educated, impeccably credentialed legal professionals whose combined hourly rates could fund a small town's budget for months. They had signatures that looked like calligraphy and degrees from universities that most people only saw in movies. Marcus Webb sat in his corner office, surrounded by windows that offered a view of the city he considered his personal kingdom. He studied the file spread across his mahogany desk, photographs of the Mitchell property mixed with legal documents and investigative reports. The house was nothing special, a simple 2-story structure with white clapboard siding and green shutters. But the land was what mattered. 30 acres of pristine countryside, perfectly positioned for the luxury development he had been planning for 2 years. Webb smiled as he reviewed his legal team's strategy. Sarah Mitchell would be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of legal pressure they could bring to bear. She was a nobody, a small-town woman who had probably never dealt with anything more complicated than a parking ticket. His lawyers had assured him that most people in her situation simply folded when faced with such overwhelming opposition. It was cheaper to relocate than to fight, and fighting a battle you could not win was the height of foolishness. The meeting with his legal team had been almost celebratory. Richardson himself, silver-haired and imposing, had outlined their approach with military precision. They would file simultaneous motions in multiple jurisdictions, creating a legal maze that would require tremendous resources to navigate. Discovery requests that demanded thousands of documents. Depositions scheduled at inconvenient times in distant locations. Every procedural weapon in their considerable arsenal would be deployed to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Hayes, the younger partner with steel-gray eyes and a reputation for ruthlessness, had suggested they could probably resolve the matter within 60 days. Most people broke under this kind of pressure within the first month, he explained to Webb. They would start with overwhelming force, then offer a settlement that seemed generous compared to the alternative of complete legal destruction. It was a formula they had perfected through years of practice. Sarah walked through her house that evening, touching surfaces that held the memories of decades. Her grandmother's rocking chair sat by the fireplace, the cushions still bearing the slight depression where the elderly woman had spent countless hours reading and knitting. Family photographs lined the mantel, capturing birthdays and holidays and quiet Sunday afternoons when the world moved at a gentler pace. The legal documents sat on the dining room table like unwelcome guests, their official seals and formal language a stark contrast to the warm familiarity of her surroundings. Sarah picked up the papers and read through them once more, her eyes moving across the text with a careful precision that seemed almost professional. She made small notations in the margins, circling specific phrases and underlining particular sentences with the methodical care of someone who understood the weight of legal language. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had stopped by earlier that afternoon, her face creased with worry and sympathy. The elderly woman had lived next door for 20 years and remembered Sarah's grandmother with fondness. She brought a casserole and gentle advice about knowing when to surrender, speaking in the soft tones reserved for offering comfort to the grieving. Sometimes, she said, it was better to take what you could get rather than risk losing everything in a fight you could not win. Sarah listened politely, serving tea from her grandmother's china set and nodding at appropriate moments. But something in her expression suggested that surrender was not as simple as her neighbor imagined. When Mrs. Patterson asked about Sarah's plans, the younger woman replied that she would need some time to review her options. The phrase carried a weight that made Mrs. Patterson study Sarah's face more carefully, as if seeing something there that had not been visible before. The phone rang that evening as Sarah was preparing dinner. The voice on the other end identified himself as James Richardson, calling personally to discuss what he termed a delicate matter. His tone carried the practiced warmth of a man who had learned to deliver bad news with the appearance of kindness. He explained that his client was prepared to be generous, offering a settlement that would allow Sarah to relocate comfortably while avoiding the unpleasantness of protracted litigation. Richardson spoke of the costs of legal battles, both financial and emotional. He painted a picture of months or years spent in courtrooms, facing lawyers who had devoted their careers to exactly this kind of complex property dispute. He mentioned the stress, the uncertainty, the way legal proceedings could consume a person's life and resources until nothing remained but exhaustion and debt. His offer, he suggested, was an act of mercy disguised as business negotiation. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of acknowledgement that could have indicated either agreement or mere politeness. When Richardson finished his carefully prepared speech, she thanked him for his time and requested 2 weeks to consider his proposal. The lawyer's slight pause suggested that such delays were not typically part of his preferred timeline, but he agreed with the magnanimous tone of someone granting an insignificant favor. After hanging up the phone, Sarah sat in the gathering darkness of her kitchen, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a house settling into evening. She opened a manila folder that had been sitting on the counter and spread its contents across the table. Legal documents, yes, but not the threatening letters from Richardson's firm. These papers were older, bearing official seals and signatures that spoke of careful preparation and legitimate authority. Sarah studied the documents with the focused attention of someone who understood their significance completely. Her finger traced along specific paragraphs, lingering on phrases that would mean nothing to most people, but carried enormous weight for those who knew how to read between the lines of legal language. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, the expression of someone who possessed knowledge that would reshape everything. Tomorrow would bring another day of pressure and intimidation, another round of legal maneuvering designed to crush her spirit and break her will. Marcus Webb and his army of lawyers believed they had identified an easy target, a simple woman who would crumble under the weight of their professional machinery. They had no idea that their carefully planned assault was about to encounter a defense they could never have anticipated, could never have prepared for, and would never forget. The Richardson, Hayes & Associates conference room gleamed with the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about expense. Polished cherrywood stretched across a table that could seat 20, its surface reflecting the soft glow of recessed lighting that had been calibrated to make everyone look successful and confident. Marcus Webb sat at the head of this impressive display, his Italian leather shoes crossed beneath the table as he surveyed his assembled legal army with the satisfaction of a general reviewing his troops before battle. 10 lawyers arranged themselves around the table like pieces on a chessboard, each representing millions of dollars in legal education and decades of experience crushing opposition in courtrooms across the state. Richardson commanded the meeting with the easy authority of someone who had never lost a case. He truly wanted to win. Hayes took notes on a tablet that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. The junior associates maintained respectful silence while the partners discussed strategy with the casual confidence of predators planning their next meal. Webb leaned back in his chair as Richardson outlined their approach, a presentation so polished it might have been rehearsed. They would overwhelm Sarah Mitchell with legal paperwork designed to drain her resources and break her spirit. Multiple motions filed simultaneously would force her to respond on several fronts at once, a tactic that worked particularly well against individuals who lacked the infrastructure to mount a coordinated defense. Discovery requests would demand thousands of documents she probably did not possess, creating impossible deadlines that would demonstrate her inadequacy. The beauty of the strategy, Richardson explained with the enthusiasm of an artist describing his masterpiece, lay in its psychological impact. Most people folded not because they lacked legitimate claims, but because they could not imagine surviving the legal process itself. The threat of bankruptcy through legal fees, the prospect of years spent in depositions and hearings, the sheer complexity of navigating procedural requirements that confused even experienced lawyers. It was warfare designed to defeat the enemy before the first battle was actually fought. Hayes pulled up aerial photographs of the Mitchell property on his tablet, images that reduced 30 acres of family history to strategic assets waiting for development. Webb studied the pictures with the focused attention of someone calculating profit margins and construction costs. The land was perfect for his planned luxury community, positioned just far enough from the city to feel exclusive, but close enough to attract wealthy buyers who wanted convenience along with their privacy. Sarah Mitchell's house would be demolished within hours of his victory, replaced by a sales office that would market dreams to people who could afford to purchase them. Webb had built his fortune by identifying opportunities that others missed, but more importantly, by recognizing when sentiment stood in the way of profit. People became attached to places for reasons that made no economic sense, clinging to houses and land that represented memories rather than assets. Sarah Mitchell was clearly one of these sentimental fools who confused emotional attachment with legal ownership. The sooner she learned the difference, the better for everyone involved. The story of how Sarah had come to possess the property was exactly the kind of family drama that created legal vulnerabilities, Richardson noted as he reviewed the investigative report. Her grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, had lived on the land for 40 years, but the chain of title contained some irregularities that an aggressive legal team could exploit. Eleanor had inherited the property from her husband, who had purchased it during a period when record-keeping was less meticulous than modern standards required. There were gaps in the documentation, missing signatures on transfer documents, and survey descriptions that did not align perfectly with current mapping technology. These imperfections were precisely the kind of technical defects that could be weaponized by lawyers who understood how to transform minor paperwork issues into major legal obstacles. Richardson's team had built their reputation by finding such weaknesses and amplifying them until they became insurmountable problems for opposition that lacked the resources to properly defend against sophisticated attacks. Eleanor Mitchell had been a simple country woman who trusted that owning land for decades was sufficient proof of ownership. Her granddaughter would soon discover how naive that assumption had been. Sarah spent the morning after Richardson's phone call driving to the county seat, her grandmother's legal documents secured in a leather briefcase that had seen better days. The building that housed the local legal aid office stood in stark contrast to Richardson's gleaming headquarters, a converted Victorian house with creaking floors and windows that rattled when trucks passed on the street outside. The sign by the front door listed office hours that suggested the lawyers here worked around the schedules of clients who could not afford to take time off from hourly jobs. Thomas Burke had been practicing law in this county for 30 years, long enough to remember when legal disputes were settled through conversation rather than warfare. His office reflected the practical approach of someone who helped real people with real problems rather than corporations with theoretical interests. File cabinets lined the walls, their contents representing decades of wills and divorces and small business disputes that would never make headlines but mattered enormously to the families involved. Burke listened to Sarah's explanation with the patient attention of someone who had heard similar stories many times before. Wealthy developers had been circling rural properties throughout the region, identifying family lands that could be acquired through legal pressure or simple intimidation. Most people in Sarah's situation accepted whatever settlement was offered, recognizing that fighting Richardson's firm would cost more than the property was worth. Burke's honest assessment was that Sarah faced a choice between expensive defeat and negotiated surrender. The lawyer's office felt cramped and outdated compared to the impressive facilities Sarah had undoubtedly seen in legal television shows, Burke admitted with self-deprecating humor. His law degree hung on the wall next to certificates from continuing education courses and photographs of local clients whose cases he had won over the years. He could provide competent representation within his means, but competing against Richardson's resources would be like bringing a knife to a gunfight. The metaphor was not meant to discourage her, merely to ensure she understood the reality of her situation. Sarah asked questions that surprised Burke with their specificity and technical precision. She wanted to know about statute of limitations issues that would affect adverse possession claims. She inquired about the specific procedural requirements for challenging survey descriptions in property disputes. Her questions about discovery rules and motion practice demonstrated familiarity with legal concepts that most non-lawyers would never encounter. Burke found himself explaining basic principles to someone who seemed to already understand their applications. When Sarah mentioned that she might need time to review the documents more carefully, Burke offered to loan her legal texts that would help her understand the complexities involved. She declined politely, explaining that she had access to resources that would allow her to research the relevant issues. The phrase struck Burke as oddly confident for someone who was supposedly facing her first serious legal challenge, but he attributed it to the kind of false optimism that often afflicted people in desperate situations. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb was already planning his victory celebration. He had scheduled meetings with architects and contractors who would transform the Mitchell property into profits that would fund his next acquisition. The development would feature custom homes starting at $2 million, each designed to attract wealthy buyers who wanted to escape urban problems while maintaining access to urban conveniences. Early market research suggested strong demand from tech executives and medical professionals who could afford to purchase luxury and privacy. Webb's assistant had prepared preliminary marketing materials that portrayed the future development as a return to simpler times, when communities were built around shared values rather than mere proximity. The irony that this vision required destroying an actual community that had existed for generations was lost on Webb, who viewed such contradictions as evidence of his sophisticated understanding of consumer psychology. People wanted to believe they were purchasing authenticity, even when that authenticity was manufactured by marketing professionals who had never lived outside major cities. The legal team Richardson had assembled represented the pinnacle of professional legal education and experience. Between them, they had graduated from Harvard and Yale and Stanford, institutions that prepared students to join the elite ranks of attorneys who shaped law rather than merely practiced it. Their combined experience included successful representation of major corporations in cases involving billions of dollars and complex regulatory issues that required armies of specialists to navigate. Against this formidable opposition, Sarah Mitchell appeared to possess nothing more than a leather briefcase full of old documents and the naive belief that legal ownership meant the same thing as moral ownership. Webb anticipated that her surrender would come within days rather than weeks, once Richardson's team began filing the motions that would demonstrate her complete inability to mount an effective defense. The 2-week delay she had requested would simply provide additional time for her to recognize the hopelessness of her situation. But Sarah was spending those 2 weeks in ways that would have surprised both Webb and Richardson if they had known to observe her activities more carefully. She visited the county courthouse during hours when most people were at work, spending time in the records office reviewing documents that stretched back decades. Her conversations with the clerks demonstrated unusual familiarity with filing systems and legal research techniques that suggested experience most civilians never acquired. The questions Sarah asked revealed knowledge of property law that went far beyond what Burke's legal texts could have provided. She inquired about specific cases that had established precedents for adverse possession claims in rural areas. She requested copies of survey records that predated the current dispute by 20 years. Her research methodology was systematic and thorough, the approach of someone who understood how legal cases were built from foundations of carefully documented evidence. Sarah's neighbors began stopping by with increasing frequency, drawn by curiosity about her legal situation and genuine concern for her welfare. Mrs. Patterson brought homemade soup and gentle advice about the wisdom of accepting whatever settlement Webb was offering. Mr. Jenkins from down the road shared stories about other families who had faced similar pressure and eventually relocated with whatever compensation they could negotiate. The consensus was clear: fighting wealthy developers was a battle that ordinary people simply could not win. But something in Sarah's demeanor suggested that she did not consider herself ordinary in the ways that mattered for this particular fight. When neighbors offered sympathy for her inexperience with legal matters, she thanked them graciously without correcting their assumptions. When they suggested she would need to find a more experienced lawyer, she agreed that representation was indeed important. Her responses were perfectly appropriate while revealing nothing about her actual level of preparation or confidence. The 2 weeks Webb had granted for Sarah's consideration were rapidly approaching their conclusion, and Richardson was preparing the next phase of legal assault. The motions his team had drafted would overwhelm any defense that Sarah's small-town lawyer could possibly mount. Discovery requests had been designed to create impossible deadlines and unreasonable demands for documentation. The psychological pressure would build systematically until surrender became Sarah's only rational choice. What none of them realized was that their carefully planned legal strategy was about to encounter defenses they had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. Sarah Mitchell was not the helpless countrywoman they imagined, and her quiet confidence was not naive optimism, but rather the calm assurance of someone who understood exactly what kind of fight was coming and exactly how to win it. The courthouse steps felt solid beneath Sarah's feet as she climbed toward the heavy oak doors that had witnessed decades of legal battles. Her leather briefcase, though worn at the edges, contained documents organized with military precision. Behind her, 3 cars from Richardson's firm disgorged an army of attorneys in $1,000 suits, their polished shoes clicking against stone like the sound of approaching cavalry. The contrast was deliberate and designed to intimidate, but Sarah's steady pace never faltered as she approached the building where justice was supposedly measured by evidence rather than expensive representation. Marcus Webb had chosen not to attend this preliminary hearing, confident that his legal team could handle what amounted to a formality. Richardson had assured him that Sarah Mitchell would likely fail to appear once she realized the magnitude of opposition arrayed against her. Most people in her situation simply disappeared rather than face public humiliation in a courtroom filled with lawyers who earn more in an hour than most families spend in months. Webb was already reviewing architectural plans for the luxury development when his phone would ring with news of Sarah's inevitable surrender. Inside the courtroom, Richardson arranged his team with theatrical precision. Senior partners occupied the front row while associates spread files across tables in displays designed to suggest unlimited resources and meticulous preparation. The message was clear to anyone observing. This was what serious legal representation looked like, and anyone foolish enough to oppose it would be crushed beneath the weight of superior expertise and funding. Sarah entered the courtroom alone, her modest appearance drawing barely concealed smirks from Richardson's associates. She wore a simple navy suit that looked professional but certainly did not suggest the kind of wealth necessary to compete against Webb's legal machine. Her briefcase was genuine leather but showed signs of use that expensive lawyers would never tolerate in their accessories. Everything about her presentation suggested someone who was trying her best but was clearly outmatched by circumstances beyond her control. Judge Harrison called the hearing to order with the efficient manner of someone who had presided over hundreds of similar proceedings. Property disputes were routine business in his courtroom, though the presence of Richardson's entire legal army suggested this case might involve more complexity than usual. He reviewed his notes briefly before inviting the parties to present their preliminary arguments, starting with the plaintiff's motion to expedite proceedings based on the allegedly fraudulent nature of the defendant's title claims. Richardson rose to address the court with the smooth confidence of someone who had delivered similar presentations countless times before. His argument was polished and persuasive, outlining the technical defects in Sarah's property documentation while emphasizing the urgent need to resolve questions that had clouded legitimate ownership for too long. He spoke of missing signatures and inadequate surveys, painting a picture of careless record-keeping that had created artificial legal complications where none should exist. When Richardson concluded his presentation, Judge Harrison turned to Sarah with the patient expression reserved for individuals who were about to be educated about the realities of legal proceedings. He asked if she was ready to respond to the motion or if she needed additional time to secure proper representation. The question carried an undertone of genuine concern, as if the judge recognized that she was about to be overwhelmed by forces she could not possibly understand or control. Sarah stood with a composure that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including the judge who had expected nervousness or confusion. She thanked the court for its consideration before launching into a response that demonstrated intimate familiarity with procedural requirements and substantive legal principles. Her argument was structured with logical precision, addressing each of Richardson's points systematically while citing relevant case law that even the experienced attorneys had not anticipated. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah's voice carried authority that had not been apparent during her conversations with Thomas Burke or her neighbors. Her citations were accurate and relevant, drawn from memory rather than hastily researched notes. She challenged Richardson's characterization of the title issues by referencing specific statutes that protected property owners from technical defects that did not affect substantial rights. Her understanding of adverse possession doctrine was sophisticated and current, incorporating recent appellate decisions that refined traditional applications. Richardson found himself taking notes as Sarah spoke, his initial confidence giving way to professional curiosity about where she had acquired such comprehensive knowledge of property law. His associates exchanged glances that revealed growing concern about what they had assumed would be a routine hearing. This was not the fumbling presentation they had expected from someone who supposedly lacked legal training and experience. Sarah's motion practice proved equally impressive when she filed counterclaims that challenged the procedural adequacy of Richardson's discovery requests. Her documents were formatted correctly and supported by appropriate authorities, demonstrating familiarity with local court rules that many attorneys struggled to master. She identified specific defects in the opposing side's filings, technical errors that Richardson's team should have caught during their supposedly meticulous preparation. The court clerk, Margaret Thompson, had processed thousands of legal documents during her 20-year career and could usually identify within minutes whether filings came from experienced attorneys or desperate individuals representing themselves. Sarah's paperwork belonged in the first category, organized and presented with professional competence that suggested extensive courtroom experience. Thompson mentioned to colleagues during their coffee break that the Mitchell woman clearly knew her way around legal procedures in ways that seemed inconsistent with her presumed background. Marcus Webb's irritation was palpable when Richardson called to report the unexpected complications that had emerged during what should have been a straightforward hearing. Webb had built his business empire by identifying easy targets and overwhelming them before they could mount effective resistance. Sarah Mitchell was supposed to be exactly this kind of vulnerable opponent, someone whose emotional attachment to family property would blind her to the futility of legal resistance against superior resources. Richardson attempted to reassure his client that temporary setbacks were normal in complex litigation, but his explanations lacked the absolute confidence that had characterized his earlier assessments. Sarah's legal responses were more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated, requiring his team to devote significantly more preparation time to issues they had expected to resolve quickly. The simple country woman who should have been intimidated by their legal arsenal was instead forcing them to work harder than they had planned. The discovery process revealed Sarah's most impressive capabilities when she submitted responses that were not only complete, but strategically crafted to expose weaknesses in Webb's position. Her document production included materials that Richardson's team had not requested, but that undermined their central arguments about title defects. She provided survey records that predated the alleged problems by decades, demonstrating continuous family ownership that satisfied even the most technical legal requirements. Sarah's interrogatory answers demonstrated knowledge of legal standards that went far beyond what any non-attorney should possess. She understood the distinction between material and immaterial facts in ways that allowed her to provide information that appeared cooperative while actually limiting Webb's ability to develop his case. Her responses satisfied discovery obligations without providing ammunition that could be used against her, a sophisticated approach that required extensive experience with litigation strategy. Hayes privately admitted to Richardson that Sarah Mitchell possessed legal knowledge that rivaled many practicing attorneys, though he could not explain how someone from her background had acquired such expertise. Her familiarity with courtroom procedures and evidentiary rules suggested formal training that should have been revealed by their background investigation. Something was clearly missing from their understanding of who they were fighting, and that gap in knowledge was becoming increasingly problematic. The most ominous moment came during a procedural conference when Judge Harrison asked Sarah about her experience with similar cases. Her response was carefully measured but revealing. She mentioned that she had been in courtrooms before and understood how property disputes typically proceeded. The phrase carried implications that made Richardson's team exchange uncomfortable glances, as if they were beginning to realize that their supposedly amateur opponent might possess advantages they had not identified or prepared for. Sarah's confidence never wavered as the legal proceedings grew more complex and demanding. While Richardson's associates scrambled to research authorities she cited from memory, she maintained the calm demeanor of someone who was entirely comfortable navigating the intricacies of legal combat. Her preparation was thorough and her execution was flawless, suggesting resources and capabilities that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. The cracks in Marcus Webb's facade of inevitable victory were becoming visible to everyone involved in the case. What had started as a simple property grab against a helpless opponent was evolving into a genuine legal battle against someone who clearly understood how to fight back. Richardson's team was being forced to work harder and longer than they had anticipated, while their supposedly certain victory was looking increasingly uncertain with each passing day. Thomas Burke watched these developments with growing amazement and concern, recognizing that his client possessed legal skills that surpassed his own in several important areas. Sarah's courtroom performance suggested experience and training that she had never mentioned during their conversations, raising questions about why someone with her obvious capabilities needed his assistance at all. The mystery of Sarah Mitchell was deepening just as the stakes in her legal battle were rising to levels that would soon demand answers none of them were prepared to provide. The counter-motion that arrived at Richardson's office on a Tuesday morning landed like a legal earthquake, its implications rippling through the firm's carefully constructed strategy with devastating precision. Sarah Mitchell had not simply responded to their aggressive discovery requests and procedural challenges. She had launched a sophisticated counterattack that demonstrated mastery of litigation tactics that even seasoned attorneys found impressive. The document was 37 pages of meticulously crafted legal argument that cited authorities spanning 4 decades of property law development. Richardson read the motion 3 times before calling an emergency meeting with his senior associates, his usual confidence replaced by the careful concern of someone who had just realized the game had changed in ways he had not anticipated. Sarah's legal writing was flawless, her arguments were persuasive, and her strategic timing was perfect. She had waited until Webb's team was fully committed to their original approach before revealing capabilities that made their previous assumptions look foolish and their tactics appear crude. The counter-motion challenged not just the substance of Webb's claims, but the procedural foundation upon which his entire case had been constructed. Sarah had identified fatal flaws in the original complaint that Richardson's team should have caught during their initial review. Her argument demonstrated that Webb lacked standing to challenge the Mitchell family's title because his own claim to interest in the property was based on speculative future purchases that had never been formalized through proper legal documentation. Hayes studied the motion with growing alarm, recognizing legal scholarship that belonged in law review articles rather than small-town property disputes. Sarah had cited cases from multiple jurisdictions that established precedents for exactly the kind of adverse possession claims that protected her family's rights. Her understanding of the doctrinal differences between states was sophisticated, and her application of those principles to local circumstances was flawless. This was not the work of someone who had learned law from internet research or library books. The most devastating section of Sarah's countermotion addressed the survey issues that Webb's team had identified as their strongest arguments for challenging the Mitchell title. Sarah provided historical documentation that demonstrated continuous family occupation and improvement of the property for over 40 years, supported by tax records, utility bills, and maintenance receipts that created an unbroken chain of evidence. Her grandmother's documentation was not defective. It was simply organized according to older standards that were perfectly legitimate under applicable statutes. Marcus Webb's reaction to the countermotion was explosive and immediate. He had built his reputation on identifying vulnerable targets and overwhelming them before they could mount effective resistance. Sarah Mitchell was supposed to be exactly this kind of easy acquisition, someone whose sentimental attachment to family property would blind her to legal realities. Instead, she was proving to be a formidable opponent who understood legal warfare better than most practicing attorneys. Webb demanded that Richardson explain how their supposedly comprehensive background investigation had failed to identify Sarah's obvious legal training and experience. Someone with her level of expertise did not acquire such knowledge casually or recently. Her familiarity with procedural requirements and substantive legal principles suggested formal education and extensive practical experience that should have been discovered during the initial assessment of opposition capabilities. Richardson assigned his best investigators to conduct a deeper examination of Sarah's background, focusing specifically on any connection to legal education or practice that might explain her surprising competence. The initial investigation had revealed a quiet woman who had lived on family property for several years after her grandmother's death, with no obvious employment or educational credentials that suggested legal training. But someone was clearly missing crucial information about Sarah Mitchell's actual qualifications and experience. The investigation revealed intriguing gaps in Sarah's recent history that suggested deliberate concealment rather than simple privacy. She had lived in the state capital for 15 years before returning to the family property, but records of her employment and activities during that period were strangely incomplete. Her educational background showed degrees that could have prepared her for legal study, but no obvious connection to law school or legal practice had been identified. Thomas Burke found himself in the uncomfortable position of representing a client who clearly knew more about legal practice than he did. Sarah's questions during their meetings demonstrated familiarity with appellate procedures and constitutional law that went far beyond what any non-attorney should possess. Her suggestions for case strategy were sophisticated, and her understanding of judicial temperament was uncannily accurate. Burke began to suspect that Sarah was allowing him to represent her for reasons that had nothing to do with needing legal assistance. The discovery process became a masterclass in legal strategy as Sarah responded to Webb's requests with precision that revealed extensive experience with litigation procedures. Her document production was organized and comprehensive, providing exactly what was required by law while revealing nothing that could be used to undermine her position. She understood the distinction between material and privileged information in ways that suggested years of practical experience with discovery rules and judicial interpretation. Sarah's deposition preparation demonstrated knowledge of courtroom dynamics that impressed even Richardson's most experienced associates. She understood how to answer questions directly without providing ammunition for opposing counsel, how to clarify ambiguous inquiries without appearing evasive, and how to use silence as effectively as speech. Her performance suggested someone who had been both giving and taking depositions for many years, though no record of such experience appeared in their background files. The most revealing moment came during a sidebar conference when Judge Harrison asked Sarah about her familiarity with a particular evidence rule that was rarely invoked in property disputes. Without hesitation, she cited the specific subsection and explained its application to their current circumstances with the fluency of someone who had taught the subject rather than simply studied it. Richardson watched this exchange with growing unease, recognizing expertise that could not be explained by casual legal education. Webb's frustration mounted as his supposedly certain victory slipped further from reach with each passing week. Sarah Mitchell was not just defending against his legal assault. She was systematically dismantling his case while building an affirmative argument for her own rights that grew stronger with each filing. His lawyers were working longer hours and charging higher fees to fight an opponent they had expected to defeat quickly and easily. The pressure was affecting Richardson's entire legal team as they struggled to match the quality of Sarah's legal work while maintaining their reputation for overwhelming opposition through superior resources. Associates who had expected to pad their billable hours with routine research were instead working nights and weekends to counter arguments that required genuine legal scholarship to address properly. The simple property dispute had evolved into complex litigation that demanded their best efforts just to remain competitive. Sarah's case research revealed something that sent shock waves through Webb's legal team when they discovered it during their own preparation. Her grandmother's property rights were not only legitimate, but were protected by specific state statutes that had been enacted to prevent exactly the kind of speculative challenges that Webb was attempting to mount. Sarah had not simply inherited land. She had inherited legal protections that made Webb's entire acquisition strategy legally impossible. The revelation forced Richardson to reassess everything about the case, from their initial strategy to their ultimate chances of success. Webb's position was not merely weak. It was potentially frivolous under statutes designed to protect long-term property owners from harassment by developers and speculators. Sarah's quiet confidence was beginning to make sense as Richardson realized that she might have known from the beginning that Webb's case was doomed to failure. During one particularly intense strategy session, Hayes suggested that they should investigate whether Sarah had legal representation that she was not disclosing, since her performance suggested access to expertise that Thomas Burke clearly did not possess. The possibility that Sarah herself might be the source of that expertise was mentioned, but dismissed as unlikely, given her apparent background and circumstances. The idea that a qualified attorney might be living quietly on family property while allowing a wealthy developer to attack her rights seemed too improbable to consider seriously. Sarah's mention during a recent court appearance that she had taken some time away from her career lingered in Richardson's mind like a puzzle piece that did not fit the picture they had constructed of their opposition. The phrase suggested professional accomplishments that were inconsistent with their understanding of her background, but no amount of investigation had revealed what that career might have been or why she had stepped away from it. The transformation in courtroom dynamics was becoming impossible to ignore as Sarah's legal arguments grew more sophisticated and her strategic positioning became increasingly advantageous. Webb's team was no longer dictating the pace and direction of litigation. They were responding to initiatives that Sarah controlled. The supposed victim had become the aggressor in legal combat that she clearly understood better than her supposedly superior opponents. Marcus Webb was beginning to realize that his carefully planned acquisition had encountered opposition that he was not equipped to handle through normal business methods. Sarah Mitchell possessed capabilities that transformed what should have been a simple property grab into a complex legal battle that threatened to expose the questionable tactics he had used in previous acquisitions. The quiet woman living on family land was proving to be far more dangerous than he had ever imagined possible. Marcus Webb stared at his phone for a full minute after ending his call with the private investigator, the implications of what he had just heard settling into his consciousness like poison spreading through his bloodstream. Detective Patricia Daniels had built her reputation on finding information that others missed, uncovering secrets that people thought they had buried successfully. Her initial report about Sarah Mitchell contained revelations that transformed everything Webb thought he understood about his opponent and made his current legal strategy look not just inadequate, but potentially suicidal. Daniels had discovered that Sarah's 15-year residence in the state capital was not the quiet domestic period that Richardson's team had assumed. Employment records showed that Sarah had worked for the state government in a capacity that required security clearance and advanced education credentials. Her salary history indicated earnings that were inconsistent with clerical or administrative positions, suggesting professional responsibilities that commanded respect and substantial compensation. Most disturbing was the gap in her employment record that began 3 years ago and corresponded exactly with her return to the family property. The investigators' most significant finding involved Sarah's educational background, which included not just the undergraduate degrees that previous research had identified, but also graduate education at the state university's law school. Sarah had not simply studied law as an academic exercise. She had completed her legal education with honors and passed the state bar examination on her first attempt. She was not a country woman who had learned legal concepts from library books. She was a qualified attorney who had been practicing law at the highest levels for over a decade. Richardson received Danielle's preliminary report while his legal team was struggling to respond to Sarah's latest motion, a document so sophisticated that even his most experienced partners were impressed by its strategic brilliance and legal scholarship. The motion challenged fundamental assumptions about Webb's standing to bring the original lawsuit, while simultaneously establishing affirmative defenses that would protect the Mitchell property from any future challenges. Reading the report while reviewing Sarah's legal work created a sickening recognition that they had been fighting a battle they were never equipped to win. Sarah's cross-examination skills became legendary during the deposition of Webb's surveyor, a technical expert who had been confident that his professional credentials and extensive experience would overwhelm any questions that a small-town property owner could pose. Instead, Sarah's interrogation revealed fundamental flaws in his methodology and exposed his failure to consider historical documentation that undermined his conclusions. Her questions demonstrated intimate knowledge of surveying standards and legal requirements that left the expert struggling to maintain his credibility. The deposition transcript read like a master class in witness examination, with Sarah systematically dismantling the surveyor's opinions through precise questions that revealed his inadequate preparation and superficial analysis. She demonstrated knowledge of technical standards that exceeded the surveyor's own understanding while exposing contradictions in his testimony that made his conclusions appear arbitrary rather than scientific. Richardson's associates who observed the deposition reported that Sarah's performance was superior to most experienced trial attorneys they had seen in similar situations. Webb's growing desperation led him to consider tactics that crossed ethical boundaries he had previously respected, at least nominally. He instructed his investigators to examine Sarah's personal life for vulnerabilities that could be exploited through social pressure or economic coercion. The suggestion that they might investigate her family members and friends for potential leverage revealed how far Webb was willing to go to salvage what had seemed like a certain victory only months before. Patricia Daniels reported that Sarah's connections to the state legal community were more extensive and significant than anyone had imagined possible. Her professional relationships included judges, prosecutors, and prominent defense attorneys who knew her not as a colleague, but as someone who commanded their respect and admiration. The implications were staggering for Webb, who had built his business model on intimidating opposition that lacked the resources or connections to fight back effectively. The most alarming discovery emerged when Daniels traced Sarah's employment history with the state government to its specific department and function. Sarah had not worked in some obscure administrative capacity that happened to require legal education. She had been employed by the judicial branch itself, working directly with judges and court administrators on matters that involved the highest levels of legal authority in the state. Her sudden departure from this position 3 years ago was described by former colleagues as a significant loss to the judicial system. Richardson found himself in the unprecedented position of representing a client whose legal strategy was being systematically destroyed by an opponent who understood the law better than his own expensive legal team. Sarah's motions were not just competent, they were brilliant examples of legal advocacy that would have impressed law professors and appellate judges. Her case citations were current and relevant, her arguments were persuasive and original, and her strategic timing was flawless. The revelation that Sarah had taken what former colleagues described as a sabbatical from her legal career rather than permanently leaving the profession sent shockwaves through Webb's entire organization. A sabbatical suggested temporary withdrawal from active practice rather than career abandonment, meaning that Sarah might return to her professional responsibilities at any time. The implications for Webb's business practices and reputation were terrifying if Sarah decided to resume her legal career with first-hand knowledge of his questionable acquisition methods. Hayes privately admitted to Richardson that continuing their current legal strategy against someone with Sarah's credentials and connections bordered on professional malpractice. They were not simply fighting a property owner who was defending family land. They were attacking a legal professional who possessed expertise and relationships that could destroy Webb's business model if she chose to examine his previous acquisitions. The stakes had escalated far beyond a simple real estate dispute into a potential investigation of Webb's entire business empire. Sarah's professional reputation within the legal community became apparent when former colleagues began appearing at court hearings as observers, their presence suggesting support that went beyond mere curiosity about an interesting case. These were not casual spectators, but respected members of the legal profession who knew Sarah personally and professionally. Their attendance at proceedings sent a clear message about the quality of opposition that Webb was facing and the consequences he might encounter if the dispute escalated further. The investigation revealed that Sarah's departure from her government position had been related to family circumstances rather than professional problems or career dissatisfaction. She had left a prestigious and influential position to care for her aging grandmother during the elderly woman's final years, demonstrating personal priorities that had commanded respect from colleagues who understood the sacrifice involved. Her decision to remain on the family property after her grandmother's death was seen as a temporary retreat rather than permanent retirement. Webb's legal bills were mounting exponentially as Richardson's team struggled to match the quality of Sarah's legal work while maintaining any hope of achieving their original objectives. Associates who had expected routine property dispute work were instead conducting graduate-level legal research to counter arguments that required genuine expertise to address properly. The simple acquisition that should have generated quick profits was consuming resources at rates that threatened the financial viability of the entire project. Detective Daniels delivered her most devastating findings during a private meeting with Webb that left him visibly shaken and uncertain about his next steps. Sarah's connections to the state judicial system were not historical relationships from her previous employment, but current associations that remained active despite her sabbatical. Former colleagues continued to consult her on complex legal issues. Judges knew her personally and professionally, and court administrators considered her temporary absence a loss that they hoped would soon be remedied. The final revelation that broke Webb's confidence completely involved Sarah's specific area of expertise within the legal profession. She had not been a general practitioner or administrative attorney during her government service. Sarah had specialized in property law and judicial administration, working directly on cases that involved exactly the kind of developer challenges and title disputes that Webb had been using to acquire rural properties throughout the region. She understood his tactics because she had been involved in stopping similar schemes by other developers who had targeted vulnerable property owners. Richardson's emergency consultation with Webb revealed the full scope of their predicament as the implications of fighting someone with Sarah's background and connections became impossible to ignore. They were not simply facing defeat in a single property dispute. They were risking exposure of business practices that could trigger investigations by authorities who knew Sarah personally and trusted her professional judgment. The quiet woman living on family land possessed the knowledge, credibility, and connections necessary to destroy everything Webb had built. Webb realized that his carefully planned acquisition had encountered opposition that he was fundamentally unprepared to handle through legal channels or business pressure. Sarah Mitchell was not just defending family property. She was potentially gathering evidence about his questionable tactics that could be used to challenge his previous acquisitions and expose methods that violated both legal and ethical standards. The hunter had become the hunted, and Webb was beginning to understand that he might have awakened something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined possible. The final hearing arrived like a day of reckoning, drawing spectators to the courthouse with the magnetic pull of impending drama that promised either vindication or devastating defeat for one of the most arrogant men in the state. Marcus Webb had assembled his complete legal army for what he intended to be an overwhelming display of force that would finally crush Sarah Mitchell's resistance and claim the victory that had eluded him for months. 10 lawyers from Richardson, Hayes and Associates filled the front rows of the courtroom, their combined presence designed to demonstrate the futility of opposing unlimited resources and elite legal expertise. Webb himself attended this hearing, his expensive suit and confident bearing suggesting a man who had never entertained serious doubts about his ultimate triumph. He surveyed the courtroom with the satisfaction of someone who owned everything he could see, his gaze lingering on Sarah's modest appearance with barely concealed contempt. She sat alone at the defendant's table, her simple navy suit and worn leather briefcase creating a stark contrast to the legal machine arrayed against her. The image was perfect for Webb's narrative about overwhelming superior opposition through sheer force of will and unlimited funding. Richardson had prepared his closing argument with theatrical precision, planning to conclude months of legal warfare with a presentation that would demonstrate Sarah's complete inability to defend against sophisticated legal assault. His team had assembled exhibits and prepared PowerPoint presentations that would visually demonstrate the technical defects in her property claims while emphasizing the professional superiority of their legal arguments. The courtroom felt like a gladiatorial arena where David was about to be crushed by a Goliath who had learned from the biblical story's mistakes. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with an expression that seemed more serious than usual, as if the day's proceedings carried implications that extended beyond routine property disputes. Court staff moved with unusual efficiency, suggesting that something significant was about to unfold that required their full attention. The clerk, Margaret Thompson, organized her files with particular care while stealing glances at Sarah that seemed to contain knowledge that other observers lacked. As the hearing began, an unusual number of legal professionals filled the gallery, their presence suggesting either professional curiosity about an interesting case or personal interest in one of the parties involved. Several faces were recognizable as prominent attorneys, judges from other counties, and court administrators whose attendance at a property dispute hearing seemed incongruous unless they possessed information about the case that was not apparent from the public record. Sarah rose to address the court with composure that had characterized her entire legal performance, but something in her bearing suggested that today's proceedings would be different from everything that had preceded them. Her confidence had evolved from quiet competence to serene authority, as if she had been saving her most powerful arguments for this final confrontation. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had observed her development throughout the case. Richardson launched into his closing argument with the polished delivery of someone who had delivered similar presentations hundreds of times, confident that superior resources and overwhelming legal firepower would finally achieve the victory that had somehow eluded his team for months. He outlined Webb's position with impressive attention to detail, citing statutes and cases that supported their challenge to Sarah's property rights while emphasizing the technical defects that his team had identified in her documentation. But as Richardson spoke, Judge Harrison's expression grew increasingly thoughtful, as if he were considering factors that were not apparent from the attorney's presentation. The judge's gaze shifted frequently to Sarah, studying her with the careful attention of someone who was recognizing details that had previously escaped his notice. Court staff exchanged meaningful glances that suggested they possessed information that would soon transform everyone's understanding of the situation. When Richardson concluded his argument and Judge Harrison invited Sarah to present her response, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted perceptibly. Sarah stood with authority that commanded immediate attention, her presence filling the space in ways that seemed inconsistent with her modest appearance. Her voice carried the kind of natural command that comes only from extensive experience addressing courts and commanding respect from legal professionals. Sarah's opening words stunned everyone in the courtroom except the court staff who had been anticipating this moment. She began by thanking Judge Harrison for his courtesy during proceedings that had allowed her to observe the legal system from an unusual perspective during her temporary sabbatical from professional responsibilities. The phrase hung in the air like an explosion whose full impact was still developing, its implications spreading through the assembled attorneys like shock waves from an earthquake. Judge Harrison's response confirmed what the court staff had known, but had kept confidential until this moment. He addressed Sarah as Judge Mitchell, explaining to the stunned courtroom that they were in the presence of the Honorable Sarah Mitchell, presiding judge of the neighboring county's Superior Court, who had been granted extended personal leave to care for family matters and had been living quietly on inherited property while handling private legal affairs. The revelation hit Marcus Webb's legal team like a physical blow, their confident expressions dissolving into horrified recognition of the catastrophic mistake they had made. They had been fighting not just a property owner defending family land, but a sitting judge who possessed 15 years of judicial experience and commanded respect throughout the state's legal community. Their aggressive tactics and condescending treatment had been directed against someone whose professional standing made their behavior not just inappropriate, but potentially career-ending. Richardson struggled to maintain his composure as the full implications of their situation became clear. His team had been attempting to intimidate and overwhelm a fellow member of the legal profession whose credentials surpassed their own and whose connections throughout the judicial system could destroy their reputations with a few well-placed phone calls. The technical defects they had identified in property documentation were being evaluated by someone who had adjudicated similar disputes for over a decade and understood property law better than most attorneys could ever hope to achieve. Marcus Webb's face drained of color as he realized that his careful investigation had failed to identify the most crucial fact about his opponent. He had been trying to steal property from a judge, using tactics that could be characterized as harassment and intimidation against someone whose professional responsibilities included protecting citizens from exactly the kind of predatory behavior he had perfected. The quiet woman he had dismissed as a helpless victim possessed the authority and knowledge necessary to expose his questionable business practices to law enforcement agencies that would investigate his previous acquisitions. Judge Mitchell's revelation of her true identity was accompanied by documentation that demonstrated the absolute legitimacy of her family's property rights and the frivolous nature of Webb's challenge. Her judicial experience had allowed her to recognize immediately that Webb's case lacked merit and was designed primarily to intimidate property owners into surrendering legitimate rights rather than face expensive legal battles. She had allowed the case to proceed in order to gather evidence about tactics that violated both legal and ethical standards. The evidence Judge Mitchell presented to the court revealed that Webb's challenge to her property was part of a pattern of similar lawsuits designed to acquire rural properties through legal intimidation rather than legitimate purchase negotiations. Her judicial connections had enabled her to research Webb's previous acquisitions, revealing multiple instances where property owners had surrendered legitimate rights rather than face the expense and complexity of defending against frivolous lawsuits supported by unlimited legal resources. Richardson found himself in the impossible position of having his client's business practices exposed by someone whose professional authority made her revelations not just credible, but actionable by law enforcement agencies. Judge Mitchell's documentation revealed that Webb had used identical tactics against elderly property owners throughout the region, filing lawsuits that challenged legitimate titles through manufactured technicalities designed to create legal expenses that exceeded the property's market values. The courtroom erupted in barely controlled chaos as attorneys and observers realized the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Webb's legal team began distancing themselves from their client with visible urgency, recognizing that their association with his questionable practices could destroy their professional reputations if they appeared to have supported tactics that a sitting judge had characterized as potentially fraudulent. The hunters had become the hunted, with their prey revealing herself as a predator whose capabilities they had never imagined. Judge Harrison announced that given the revelation of Judge Mitchell's professional standing and the evidence she had presented about Webb's business practices, he was not only dismissing Webb's case, but was referring the matter to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of potential fraud and abuse of legal process. The defendant had become the prosecutor, transforming what Webb had intended as his victory celebration into the beginning of his legal destruction. Webb's team abandoned him with the efficiency of rats fleeing a sinking ship, their expensive suits and impressive credentials proving worthless against opposition that possessed superior legal authority and unshakable moral credibility. Richardson's firm would spend months dealing with disciplinary investigations and malpractice claims resulting from their association with tactics that Judge Mitchell's evidence revealed as systematic abuse of the legal system. The aftermath was swift and devastating for Marcus Webb, whose business empire crumbled under investigations that Judge Mitchell's evidence had triggered. Property owners throughout the region who had surrendered their rights to avoid expensive litigation now possessed documentation that their decisions had been based on fraudulent legal threats. Class action lawsuits emerged as victims discovered that Webb's supposed legal victories had been achieved through intimidation rather than legitimate property rights. Judge Mitchell's return to the bench was celebrated throughout the state's legal community, with colleagues expressing relief that her temporary absence had ended and that her expertise would again be available to the judicial system. Her experience defending family property while gathering evidence about predatory development practices enhanced her reputation as someone who understood both the law and the real-world consequences of legal decisions. The Mitchell property became the site of a legal clinic that Judge Mitchell established to assist rural property owners in defending against frivolous challenges and predatory acquisition attempts. Her experience had demonstrated that wealthy developers could abuse the legal system to steal legitimate property rights, but also that knowledge and determination could protect families from sophisticated predators who relied on intimidation rather than legitimate legal authority. Marcus Webb's final legal bills exceeded $2 million, money spent to achieve not victory, but complete destruction of his business model and personal reputation. He faced criminal investigations, civil lawsuits, and professional disgrace that transformed him from predator to pariah in a legal community that no longer tolerated the tactics he had used to build his fortune. The quiet woman living on family property had revealed herself as his most dangerous enemy, someone whose authority and connections made resistance not just possible, but devastatingly effective. Judge Sarah Mitchell had proven that justice sometimes required patience and strategic thinking, allowing predators to reveal themselves fully before striking with legal authority that crushed them completely. Her victory protected not just her own family's rights, but established precedents that would shield future victims from similar predatory schemes, transforming personal defense into public service that reflected the highest ideals of legal profession.